we see what it says there. I read, they were aware of it and fled unto Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth about. Then we now see in verse 8, and there sat a certain man at Lystra, right? So there's a certain man at Lystra, and what do we see about him? Well, what we see about him in Lystra, he was impotent in his feet, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never walked. Verse 9, the same heard Paul speak. Then it says, who steadfastly beholding him and perceiving that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, stand upright on thy feet. Right? And he leaped and walked. Right? In verse 11, and when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, right? Saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. Verse 12, they called Barnabas Jupiter and Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. 13, then the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and gallons unto the gates, and will have done sacrifice with the people. Right now, in verse 14, which when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of, they rent their clothes and ran in among the people, crying out and saying, sirs, why do you those things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth, the sea, and all the things that are therein, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Now, let's look at these together. So what we see then is that in from this Acts and chapter 14, that we see that Paul is in Lystra, and the priests of Jupiter and the people that worship Jupiter, they are running because Paul has done or wrought or performed a miracle. And in Paul performing the miracle, they began to treat Paul as though Paul was the gods come down to the earth. Now, in verse 15, learn this and learn this well. When that happened, Paul and Barnabas did not say, these people are now magnifying us. No, rather Paul and Barnabas, they tore their clothes, their own clothes, right? And they were saying that, well, it is vanity or idol worship that makes people misunderstand fellow human beings and want to deify or make a god out of fellow human beings. So it is gullible idolatry that was disturbing the people, right? Without the people saying all those things, right? Paul and Barnabas were already able to do miracles. Yeah, so that tells us something, that Paul and Barnabas, right, did not need the people, right, to adopt that mindset before miracles could be done, right? So, in other words, Paul and Barnabas, they did not need the people to look at them as gods before Paul and Barnabas could do miracles in their midst. Right, so it is gullible men, idolatrous men, yeah, that want to make a god out of a fellow man. Will observe what Paul and Barnabas did, though. They did not accept such worship from their fellow men. Is that clear? They did not accept such worship from their fellow men. But look at verse 15 very, very carefully. It says that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and the earth and the sea and all things that are therein. So in other words, heaven, earth, the sea, together with the resources, right, that are inside the sea or under the sea or inside the land or under the land and all those kind of things. For example, oil. Today we'll talk about crude oil and all those kind of stuff. So all those things like crude oil or material resources, they are God's provision for men. So God is the one that provided that. Now, that is quite interesting. So they are God's provision for men. Now, I want you to pay close attention to some other things that will follow on from here. Now, look at verse 16. Okay, look at verse 16. So we're told that God was long suffering towards people in India when they were ignorant. Now, but look at verse 17. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good. Observe. So, whatever we are about to read, right, is how what Paul said God did good. What is the good that God did? He said, and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our heart with food and gladness. Now, let's unpack that. So, what does God do? God did good. What is the good? He gave us rain, which means God provides the conditions, right, that cause men to be cared for. You see, God provides those conditions. Now, in this case, God gave rain, right? So this rain, clearly, if you look at the rain, he gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons. Okay, so in other words, this kind of rain, right, led to fruitful seasons. So in other words, the seasons themselves, right, needed the rain. So the seasons needed the rain. So you can think of this rain as life-given rain or food-given rain. Now, there is something to understand, that when it is said that God gave food, what exactly does that mean? Come with me to Psalm 104. Come back. Psalm 104. Yes, Psalm 104. And I'm just going to, sorry, I'm in the middle of a thought here, and I'm going to go to verse 14. It says, that's talking about God. God causes the grass to grow for the cattle and herb for the service of man, that is man now, that man, may bring forth food out of the earth. Look at that. Yeah. So man may bring forth food. So God is a supplier of conditions, right? So he's a supplier of conditions that help food to grow, right? So is that if you stay in that Psalm 104 and verse 14, so God is a supplier of the conditions that cause food for food to grow. However, how does food come to man? So how does God's supply, right? How does God's supply become food? Right? So observe what the psalmist says. He says that he may bring forth. Can you see? He may bring forth. So, in other words, the food will need to be brought forth. So that means man must draw or extract the food from the ground. So again, so man must extract the food from the ground, which means man needs food extraction skills. Yeah, so he needs food extraction skills, right? It's one thing for the food to be present in the ground. It's a totally different thing for the man to know how to get the food out of the ground. Now, come back with me to what we are reading in Acts chapter 14 and verse 15. So if you come back with me to Acts chapter 14 and verse 15, we will notice the following, right? We will notice the following, which is important for our studies tonight. We will notice the following. What will we notice? Come back to Acts 14 then. Acts chapter 14, and I am in verse 15. I read, it says, And since why do you do these things? We also are men of like passions with you and preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God. Pay attention, unto the living God which made heaven and the earth and the sea and all the things that are therein. So what did God do? So God made the earth, or you can say the seas. So he made the earth, he made the seas, right? And the resources, right? The resources inside the earth, right? Or the sea. Is that clear? Now, from what we learned in Psalm 104 and verse 14, right? So from what we learned about from Psalm 104 and verse 14, right? Man must extract what is in the ground. Can you see? So man must extract like food, for example, that is in the ground. By the same token, man must extract the oil from the sea. So he must extract the oil from the sea, right? The oil does not come looking for the man. Can you see? So the oil, right, it does not come looking for the man. Rather, the man must have the skills. So he must have the skills to extract the oil. You see now? So just like man must have the skill to extract the food. Yeah. So in other words, what God supplies, yeah. Look at it one more time. So what God, right, supplies to man, okay, a man requires skill in order to benefit from it. One more time. So what God supplies to man, man requires skill, right, to get the benefit that God intended. One more time, to get the benefit that God, right, intended. So, in other words, what we're seeing then is that whereas God makes resources available to men, the resources are often not on the surface. Man needs to have the know-how to get to the resources, to extract the resources, and then we now that is how the supplies of food, for example, comes to man. Look at Proverbs and chapter 12. Proverbs and chapter 12. Proverbs, right, and chapter 12. And I am in verse 11. I read, he that tilleth his land, so the man that tills his land shall be satisfied with bread. Okay, that tells you something. So, in other words, to till the land, okay, to till the land, right, is part of how to receive the bread that God gives. Okay, so the bread that God gives, it's one thing to say that He gives us food. Okay, so because we read in Acts 14, right, that God He gives food. Now we are seeing in Proverbs 12, right? In Proverbs 12, though, right, the way to receive the food. So the way to receive the food, right, is by man exercising some skill. Yeah. So it's by man exercising some skill to receive God's provision. So God is a provider, man is the extractor. So man will use labor, man will use skill in order to draw upon, extract, or receive from God's provision. In other words, work then is part of the God-given process, right? So work is part of the God-given avenues, right, for accessing. Yeah. So for accessing what God provides through creation. So God creates resources, makes these things available. But in order to access it, in order to get to it, man must skillfully exercise labor. So, in other words, what we're seeing then in Proverbs chapter that we just read in Proverbs 12 and Proverbs 12 and verse 11, one more time. He that tilleth his land shall be satisfied. So, in other words, what we're seeing then is, right, that a man who has access to the land, okay, well, can receive what God supplies through the land. Okay, so what God supplies through the land. Meaning, if a man does not have the land, okay, God still supplies, okay, God still supplies, but the man is now limited, right, in his capacity, right, to receive God's provision, right? So is limited in his capacity then to receive God's provision, right? God is still a provider, but the man has no land. One more time. So God is still a provider, okay, but the man in that scenario, right, has no land. So it doesn't have a factor of production. And if it doesn't have it, it will look like God is not a supplier, but God is. Now, so what are we learning then from what Solomon is saying in Proverbs? It means that God doesn't do the work of extraction for the people. Yes, so God doesn't do the work of the diligent, right? Diligent exercise of skill. Okay, He doesn't do that for people. Yeah, rather He provides the means, okay, by which labor is made fruitful. He will supply the means, right, by which labor is made fruitful. Come with me to Acts chapter 14 again. Acts chapter 14, and I'm back to where we started from. So we're saying that God is a supplier and that man is an extractor. Man is one that takes to distribute. Okay, so from that Proverbs, then we can see that in Proverbs 12:11, that man is one who distributes. So is the one that will take what is supplied and spread it. So man takes what God has supplied, okay, and then man spreads it. Man spreads it. Very, very important. Come back with me to Acts 14 and in verse 17. Verse 17, I read. It says, nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good. So what did God do? He did good and gave us, right, rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Okay, so what do we see? Rain from God is spoken of as God's goodness. Now, what is interesting is, so the rain that God gives is the rain that promotes harvest. One more time. So God's rain, very important. So God's rain is good rain. Now, there are other rains, okay? There are other rains that do not, right? So they do not promote life. Rather, they take life. Okay, now you must be careful because if you don't read the Bible properly, right, or interpret properly, you will think that God sends two kinds of rains, right? So, but God, right, God does not send two types or two kinds of rain, right? He sends one. He sends one, right, and men reap one. So he sends one, which is the rain that causes a harvest. Whereas the harvest in this case to satisfy the heart of man, right? Whereas there is another rain, and that rain will be described as God letting man have what is in man's heart. Okay, that's very important. So there is a rain which is simply men reaping the consequences, right, of abandoning God's way. So men reaping the consequences, for example, right, of abandoning God's way. This is very, very important. Whereas when men embrace God's way, that is the rain that is talking about here. So God's way, right, in it there is His rain, and that rain, what it does is that it supplies food. Okay, now anyway, so let's go on. So is there rain that can damage somebody's farm? Of course, but God is not that kind of rain, right? So there are other factors at work when you begin to talk about a rain that is damaging, right? It is not from God. Now, let me say it again. The rain that God gives it for the benefit of man. Because here we see in Acts 14:17, right? It says, nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good. So the reign of God is God doing good. Now, it is for man's benefit. Now, so in other words, if I was to see rain that is damaging man and that which belongs to man, I am seeing something that has a signature that is not purely God's signature. Anyway, but the thing I want you to see here is this in this Acts 14:17 is that he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food. Okay, so what does God do? God makes food available. One more time, God makes food available. Go back to Proverbs and chapter 12. So if you look at Proverbs and chapter 12, how does God make food available? Look at verse 11. He that tilleth his land shall be satisfied with bread. So a man that diligently exercises the skill of drawing the natural resources will have food from God. So to say that God makes food available is to say that man will receive that food by the skillful deployment of labor. Do you understand now? So let me say one more time. So what does that mean then? It means that if a man refuses to till the land, so if a man refuses to till the land, okay, what does that mean? It means the man is refusing to work or skillfully use labor. Yeah, so he's refusing to skillfully use labor. What happens? Well, the man will forfeit, right, or prevent his own access to the provision of God. So he prevents, right, he prevents his access, right, to God's provision. You see now, it prevents his access to God's provision. He forfeits the provision, even though God is a provider. So, in other words, what have we seen thus far? What we just saw now means that God has structured this earth. Yeah. So God has structured this earth. Yeah, such that it is labor, it is skillful labor that receives what God has supplied. So again, God has structured this earth that way, right? So that it is skillful labor, right? So it is skillful labor that receives God's provision. In other words, those guys in Acts 14:17 in Lystra, so the guys in Lystra, okay, although they were pagans, right? If they, right, skillfully use labor, they will receive God's provision, right? So if they skillfully, right, if they skillfully use labor, right, what will happen is they will receive God's provision. So in other words, man receiving God's provision, are you following? So man receiving God's provision is irrespective of the man's belief system, right? So it is irrespective, that's important, right, of the man's belief or persuasion. Yeah. So it's irrespective of, and I'm going to say one more time, it's irrespective of the man's belief or persuasion. So if the man may not even believe that God exists, but if he diligently applies or skillfully applies labor, he will be able to get the provision that God has put there. Okay, so man receiving God's provision is irrespective of man's persuasion, right? So God doesn't say, oh, if you are a believer, you'll be able to access it. If you are not a believer, you won't be able to access it. No, that's not the way that God is. Now, look at Deuteronomy and chapter 28. So what we're saying then is that God is the supplier and man is the one that uses skillful deployment of labor to extract or receive what God has supplied. Look at Deuteronomy 28, and I'm going to go to verse 12. Follow closely. The Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure, the heaven to give rain unto thy land in his season. You see, so when looking, did you see that the Lord shall open unto thee his good treasure? It says, what is happening in that opening? It says here, the heaven to give rain. Can you see? So the heaven, what it means is that the skies or the clouds, right? So it means that the clouds, right, will give rain. So it's talking about the ecosystem that God has put in place on the earth. There's the earth, there's the cloud, there's the water cycle, and all those kind of things. It says, the heaven to give the rain unto thy land in a season. So the man should have a land. You see it again. So the man should have a land. If he doesn't have a land and there's a lot of rain, then there's nothing for the man to actually harvest. So it says, rain unto thy land in a season, and to bless all the work of your hand. You see, so to bless all the work of your hand. So that tells us what you've been saying, right? That God blesses, yeah, what a man puts his hand to. What does it mean to say God blesses what a man puts his hands to? It is simple. What it means then, right, is that man receives God's provision, right, by the diligent application of skill. Okay, so man receives God's provision, right, by the diligent, right, application, right, of skill. That's the meaning of what it says, that God blesses what you put your hands to. Your hand is your skill, your vocation. So in other words, yeah, it is our vocation. Okay, so our vocation or career or skill, whatever you want to call it, that receives, right, God's provision. You see now, so having a skill is a way of providing a means, a channel, a mechanism for assessing what God has supplied. Is that clear? Now, so by extension, if it says here to bless all the work of thine hand, then it means that if a man does not work, then there is nothing to bless. Or put it differently, if you want to put it in a very clear language, because we're really talking about, will man work or will man not work? That's what's at stake here. So if a man does not work, it means that man won't receive God's provision. Yes. So man will receive God's provision, right, in the absence. Okay. So when you have the absence of diligent application of skill. Is that clear? So the man, so in other words, it's not that God sometimes says, oh, I will be a giver. And at other times he says, no, I won't be a giver. So God does not fluctuate. So he doesn't fluctuate in provision, right? Rather, men, they fluctuate in the application of skill. So men fluctuate in the application, okay, of skill. So therefore, they don't receive God's supply. Yeah. So we're going step by step so that it is clear. So if a man does not have a vocation, if a man does not have a skill, then the man actually, by that activity, has actually blocked the mechanism by which he receives. Okay. Now, so what does all that mean? It means that to say that, oh, God provides, is to really say that God uses our skill, our diligence, right, to cause us to receive. Do you understand? So that's how God really operates from the scriptures that we are reading, or that we are reading and have read. Come back again, and let's look at Acts chapter 14. Yeah, I'm flipping between Acts 14, Deuteronomy, Acts 14, Proverbs, Acts 14. Now let's get back to Acts and chapter 14 again. Acts chapter 14, and I'm back in verse 17. In verse 17, it says, nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good, and gave us rain from heaven, and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food. So we've gone through this filling our hearts with food, because how does God do that? Deuteronomy 28:12, to bless all the work of your hands. So what does that mean exactly? Well, where you apply labor in the land. You see now that Deuteronomy. So you apply labor, right, in the land. What does that mean? It means that God supplies ground, God supplies seed, God supplies favorable conditions, what is called rain and sun and co. And then, but there must be a man who is going to till the ground. So, and plant the seed. And then that man will be there to harvest the seed. And that way it will extract the harvest from the ground. That is putting together all the scriptures I've used tonight. Yeah, then that man will then distribute what he has taken from the ground through the market system. So God the supplier, God the creator, man the distributor. How does man get to be a distributor? By being a receiver. How does man receive? By the skillful deployment of labor. Okay, now, so what that tells us then, putting all of this together at this point, will be that God has put systems, right? So God has He has put systems in the earth, right? But that means that, for example, when you look at rain, so there's a water cycle. There's how the water on the ground becomes water in the cloud. There's how that water in the cloud then falls back as rain, and all that cycle just continues. So God has put those systems in place. Then, because it takes the skillful application of labor, right, to extract and to receive from God's provision, then the man, right, he uses knowledge to gain access to and to harvest the God-given resources. You see now, so to access the God-given resources. Come with me to Matthew. Look at Matthew and chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and I'm going to go to verse 45. Look at what it says in verse 45. That you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Okay, so when it says Father in heaven, if you read the previous verse, it says, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, go to them that hate you, right? And pray for them that despitefully use you and persecute you. So what are men doing? They are persecuting, they are despitefully using, they hate, they curse their enemies. But what is God like? God is not in their enmity, God is not in their curse, God is not in their despitefully using, God is not in their persecution. So how does the Bible explain that? It is called our Father in heaven. So he is not in the earthy, fleshly, carnal ways of man. Yes. So when it says your Father which is in heaven, right, it means Father, right, unlike the earthy, right, or fleshly or carnal haters, right? The carnal haters, or let's start with the carnal enemies, okay, of verse 44, who are the cursers, okay, you see now, they are the cursers, and they are the haters, they are the abusers, it goes on and on. So God is not like any of that. So that is called Father in heaven. It means he's in the higher plane. He's in the invisible dimension. He's not in the hatred, the cursing, the dislike. He's not in all of that. Anyway, so what does he do in verse 45? Our Father which is in heaven, he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. So his sun, meaning God will supply the same sun to the evil and the good. He will supply the same sun, the same rain. So, in other words, the variation in human morals or the variation in human spiritual growth, notwithstanding, right? It will not make God say to one I give rain, to another I don't give rain. It won't make God say to one I give sun, to the other I don't give sun. No. So God will not show favoritism, right? There's no vary. So man can vary, because here it says it makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. So some men evil, some men good, but God sends the same sun. You get the point now? So in other words, what that means is that God has made the material earth in such a way that it is equally accessible to all men, whether just or unjust, whether good or evil. Okay, so God sends rain on the just and on the unjust. So the just will have access to the rain, the unjust will have access to the rain. Why? God has put systems in place in the earth. It is already in play on the earth that will work independent of whether a man is good or bad, or independent of a man's persuasions, right? That is quite important. Now, the other thing to notice, right, is that the resources of this earth, sun, and rain, is available to all men, whether they are believers or not. Right? God does not discriminate that way. Come with me to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. I am in verse 16. Look at what it says in verse 16. In verse 16, what we see is while Paul waited for them, okay, who are the them? Look at verse 14. So while Paul waited for them, okay, so I want you to see that the them, right, it refers to Timothy, all right, and Silas. Can you see? It's Timothy and Silas. Then we now go back to verse 16. In verse 16, it says, while Paul waited for them, that means for Timothy and for Silas at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. So we are seeing a city, right, like Lystra that we just saw in Acts 14, right? So, and we notice that even in Acts 14, God was good. Can you see? So God was described as is good. Now, look at verse 24. I'm going to skip all the way in Acts 17. Come with me to verse 24. In 24, it says, God, Paul is talking. He's talking to idolaters. Don't forget that. So Paul, right? Paul is talking to idolaters, men that are into idols, right? So he's talking to idol-heavy men that are steeped in idolatry. It says God that made the world. Notice again, God made the world and all things therein. So what would be that? Would mean God made the earth and all its resources. Okay, He made the earth and all its resources, and God made the earth that it may have resources. So it says here, seeing Acts 17:24, seeing that He is Lord of all and Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. Right. So what we learn from here is that God made the world, God made the resources that are in it. So therefore, the material resources or provisions. So I mean things like oil, or like the various metals, precious metals that are in the earth. They did not appear there magically or randomly or by mistake, but by design. Right. So God put it there by design. That is quite interesting. Look at verse 25. Neither is worshipped with man's hands, or as though he needed anything. So what does that mean? It means that although God made the earth, He doesn't need the earth. Although God made the resources that are in the earth, He doesn't need those resources. He doesn't need anything. Yeah. So why are the resources there? That's the valid question. Why are the resources there? Well, Acts 17:25 answers it. It says, neither is worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth. So it says God doesn't need it, sorry for the grammar, but He giveth. So He giveth to all, life and breath and all things. So God is a giver, and is a giver to all. So it does not discriminate in providing the resources that He provides on the earth. Come with me to Deuteronomy and chapter 15 quickly. Deuteronomy then and chapter 15. I want you to see what it says. Deuteronomy chapter 15, and I'm going to go to verse 4. It says, look, let me read from verse 1. Deuteronomy chapter 15 from verse 1. At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release. Oh my God. Look, at the end, okay, of every 7 years. Yeah. So every 7 years, God is training these people. Yeah. He's training men to make a release. Wow. So it says, thou shalt make a release. Now, it says, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lended aught unto his neighbor shall release it. So in other words, we see from verse 2 there is a financial reset. Okay, so it says, he shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor nor of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. So, in other words, the Lord, okay, watch carefully. So, the Lord releases men, okay, so he releases men from their financial, right, or from their economic, however you want to put it, economic weirdness, right? How? Through the men, okay? So it's through the men who let other men, okay, go free, right? Via a reset. Let me say it one more time. So it is the Lord's release, right? So when it says, oh, so it is the Lord's release, but the Lord's release, okay, is then explained in verse 1. So in verse 1, at the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release. So it is thou or man, right, that makes the release. So in other words, the Lord's release, right, is seen in the men who listened to the Lord releasing other men. So the Lord's release, right, it is seen, right, in men who listened to God, okay, who listened to God, now letting other men, yeah, go free. That is the Lord's release. So that is quite a powerful piece of, look at verse 3. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with your brothers, thine hand shall release. So God is teaching these Israelites to practice a neighborliness, right, that releases men. Now, so this is quite interesting. So look at verse 4. Save when there shall be no poor among you. The King James has written that in a weird way. So the King James, right, is not clear in what the way it is worded. If you read that in like the NIV, for example. So I want us to look at the NIV together. We want to look at the NIV of that text. Yeah, the NIV of which text? Well, we want to look at the NIV of Deuteronomy and chapter 15. Yes, so Deuteronomy and chapter 15, and I'm going to read verse 4. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 4. However, there need be no poor people among you. For in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. Listen very carefully. So in verse 4, yeah, so in verse 4, it is said that he will richly bless you. Remember what was said in verse 3. If you look at verse 3, it says in verse 3, I'm coming. So in verse 2, so he has said something in verse 2. It says, because it is called the Lord's release. Yeah. So the Lord's release is explained in verse 1 as a man releasing, right, another man. So a man releasing another man. Now, so when it says in verse 4 that he will richly bless you, what are we talking about? It means God, okay, blessing, right, a man through another man. That's important thing. So it's blessing a man through another man. Now, watch carefully. What is being described is that thing in verse 1. It's about what happens every 7 years. So every 7th year, well, is called the year of release, right? So when it says God will bless you, it means, right, that is describing something that God wants to do to everyone in the land. What is that blessing? Well, it is men, okay? So it is men, right, who practice the year of release. So when you say God will bless you in the land, it means the land will be a land where there will be men that will take God serious enough that they will practice that reset, right, every seventh year. Now, what would then be the consequence of it? So what is the consequence, right, of the reset? So what's the consequence, right, of the reset that God put in place? It means that there will be no poor person amongst them. Yes, that's what it means. It means there will be no poverty, right? Right in their midst. Why? Because poverty, yeah, is not God's plan. Now, but in order for that to be realized, okay, so it will be realized if men operate by God's law of release, right? It will. That's how it is going to be. It's going to come to pass. So God wants men free from poverty, right? However, in order for that to happen, men must release or other men who are in some sort of economic dilemma or all those kind of stuff. But the point I want to get across to you is that, right, God is not the one orchestrating or building or enforcing poverty. So, in other words, verse one means is that when men, right, when they listen to God, right, they will let their they will practice the reset. Yeah, the reset. They will practice it. However, if men do not listen to God, there will be no reset. Okay, let me say one more time. So, if men don't operate by the law of release, so when they do not listen to God, they will not practice the reset. They will not practice. Then what will then happen? Right? Well, it means that the poor remain poor, right? So the poor remain poor. Thus, the men will create what poverty. They will create poverty because people will be in circumstances that they have no way out of. Are you following now? So, just to continue, then, what we're seeing then is that everybody. So imagine if everybody is given a reset, then people who used to have land that they lost will have a land again, right? So God will give land, yeah, back to men who had lost it. Yes. So it will give land to men who have lost it. Then what will then happen now is that all the men will now have access to land. They will have access to a factor of production, a significant factor, land. Then what's going to happen? Then when men have access to land, right? Then according to other things we've read tonight, so those men will then, right, have access. They will have access to use their skill. They will have to use their skill, right, to receive God's provision. That will happen. They will use the skill to receive God's provision. However, that is verse 4, right? Come all the way down to uh, um, verse 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 11. Yeah. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Right? So, the poor shall never cease. Look at that interesting thing. So, it means that God, God was telling these guys that they were not going to. So, it's because men would find the idea of releasing other men. Yeah. So they'll find it non-palatable. Yes. So the idea of them releasing other men, they'll find it non-exciting. Let me use that kind of terminology. So what then happens? So what we then see is that although God does not want poverty perpetuated in the land, where in reality men, right, find it difficult to do a reset, to let another man go free. So what then happens is that because people are not practicing the year of release, right? So the year of release, if you check Luke, I said Luke, Leviticus 25, yeah, then every 7 years, so they say when you have the 7 years, 7 years, when you have 7 years 7 times, yeah, the year that follows is then called the Jubilee. So a person that does not practice the seventh year of release will definitely not practice the Jubilee, because that is now every 50th year. So 7 times 7, then the year that follows, that's 50. Now, so people then don't practice that. Then what then happens is you would then have the poor that are always there. Do you see now? So it means that poverty, right, in that case, will exist not because there is not enough to go around in a reset, right? But it's because men are actually not distributing or resetting. Yes. So let me say one more time. The implication of looking at this, I mean, well, I'm going into quite an interesting thing that God through Moses wanted to teach Israel. Yeah. So, but what we see, what the writings of Moses is showing, right, in this portion of Deuteronomy, is that God is not the creator of poverty. Right? God is not the creator of poverty. Rather, God richly blesses men through the actions of men that practice the release. Yeah, the practice, in other words, they allow a way for people to come out of their predicament, and there's a reset that is given. Then the people go for it one more time. Now, so when it says that God will richly bless, let's go back to it again. Deuteronomy and chapter 15. Yeah, and chapter 15, and we're back in verse 4, right? So it says, save when there shall be no poor among you, for the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. So men have to possess it, which means men have to take control of the land. And then in taking control of the land, what will happen is God greatly blesses. What does it mean? God greatly blesses is that men begin to operate by God's law of release. Okay, so when men begin to operate by God's law of release, what then happens is people that were in hopeless circumstances, they get a reset. You see now, they get a reset. Now, let's get back to Acts 14 before I go tonight. Acts 14, quickly. Acts chapter 14. So, what the main thing I went into all that for was for us to see that embedded in the Holy Read, in the Hebraic scriptures, in Genesis to Malachi, is that God is already for thousands of years been teaching man, right, effectively how to dismantle poverty. So poverty is not God made, it is man made, man sponsored, man enforced, right? And the nut and bolt of it is in that Deuteronomy 15. Now, come with me to Acts chapter 14 then, and we're back to verse 17. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. So, what did God do? God did good. How did he do good? He gave them rain, right? He gave them rain, which exactly is in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5 that we read, that he gives his rain both to the evil and the good, or just and unjust as the case is. Yeah. So again, God gave what again? Fruitful season. He gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons. Now, what does that tell us? So when the seasons are not fruitful, what is it? It means that men are not operating as God has already told men to operate. Yet, so they are then experiencing something that is not God's gift. Yeah, but what is God's gift? Well, it fills the hearts of men with food and with gladness. Yeah. Now, let's break that down so you get a point. What does it mean to say God gave fruitful fruit? Remember, fruitful. Now, so if it is fruitful, then there will be a seed and a harvest. That's how fruitful happens. Yeah? So, what will happen? Number one is that the seed becomes a harvest. Well, in that, God gave us food. How does He do it? He gives ground. Then what happened is man will skillfully put seed in the ground, right? And then that means men are planted, and then the because the seed will not put itself in the ground. Then when the seed in the ground, God gives rain, and from the rain there's a harvest. And then from the harvest, how do you harvest? Well, we read it earlier in Proverbs that it is man that will skillfully use knowledge to bring what is in the earth, the seed, and all those kind of stuff, to bring it out in a way that others can enjoy. Now, so not only is there a seed, there's a planting, not only is there a planting, there's a nurturing, there's a watering, then there's a harvest, and there's a distribution to take it to the market, right? And then when it gets to the market, what happens then is that the men then take or receive or buy from what is available in the market, then they now cook it. Then you can now say that God has given them, has filled their hearts with food. So that simple statement, God has filled our heart with food, is a condensed statement that includes all of those long things that I just said now, right? So men must plant it, men must water it, men must harvest it, men must distribute it, men must share it or serve it, and then only then, when it's now being cooked as food, does it then become food. Yet, so the statement "God gave us food," right, actually means that for food to get to man, right, God has a path, and then man has a path. Now, and that's quite interesting. So, with that expression, God gave us food, very, very condensed statement. It's a very condensed statement. Yeah. Uh, Again, like we've said, right? Like we've said, God really wanted man to practice the year of release, but that idea is foreign to men. Now, but what makes it foreign to men is a hardness of heart. Yeah, and in the hardness of heart, you then have the resistance to the very thing that we're trying to that God is trying to achieve. Yeah, which is supply. Now, the thing to understand is this, that look at Matthew 26 as I round up. Look at Matthew 26. Look at this statement. Matthew 26:11. Jesus said, "For ye have the poor always with you." Look at that. You have the poor always with you. Now, why? Why that statement? Well, it's what we've explained in Deuteronomy. Is because, right, God gave instructions about the year of release, the year of the Lord's release, which is every seventh year. Then in Leviticus 25, he gave instructions about what is called the year of Jubilee, which is every 50 years. Right? Every 50 years, what will then happen is everything returns to its original owner or steward, as the case is. Right? So, in other words, God baked into their system a way for people to have a reset, to have their debts cancelled, for the slaves to go free, right? But men did not practice it, right? So therefore, there's poverty. So there's a poverty on earth, and that poverty is not God made, it is man made. Men are the ones that are actually almost afraid, you see, to practice what God has taught right in Moses' writings about understanding the law of release, or God's release, or the Lord's release. And for as long as that happens, then what happens then is that there's a perpetuation, or there's something at work that continues to multiply poverty. So the key thing to notice tonight is that poverty is man-made. It's not God-made, right? God's own plan is totally different, but is working in the earth through His men until we have men then that prioritize the release of the Lord. When that happens, then you see what happens then is that people then have an opportunity to have access to the primary factors of production